Hi everyone, and you are welcome to Property in Python OOP lecture. Great! Now my friends, you are familiar with all types of methods and attributes. So let's start to upgrade our information a bit. Let me say that I have an instance attribute, its name age. And what will happen if I try to initialize the value of this attribute by a negative value, like -10? If I use just a simple instance attribute, the value will be accepted, but it doesn't make sense to have a negative value for the age. So the question now, how I can add kind of pre-processing before I set or get a value? In order to know that, join me in this lecture. In this lecture, we will learn about a new concept in Python OOP, which is property. So I'll start by defining what a property is. Then we will see why we have to use a property and how I can define a property. And I'll end up this lecture by a quick summary. So let's get started. Okay, before we start, I want you please to be patient until you see the code session in order to see a complete working examples. Before we start, I want to tell you that if you are learning property for the first time, the concept is a bit confusing. So be patient until you watch the code session, and after this code session and after you see some real examples, everything will be clear and easy. So let's start by talking about what a property is. Simply, property is a built-in function in Python, which means you don't define this function by yourself. Usually, this function creates and returns a property object. And when I say I have an object, you can just imagine that this is an object from a predefined class for you. Usually, with this object, there are three methods related. We call them getter, setter, and deleter. I use getter usually to define the logic that I want to be executed when I get an instance attribute value. And I use setter method to define the logic that I want to be executed when I want to set instance attribute value. And finally, if you want to delete this instance attribute, in other words, convert its value into null, what is the logic that I want to be executed? Usually, it's defined in deleter function. Okay, so from the previous slide, we understand that the property is an object with three methods: getter, setter, and deleter. The question now, why I have to use this property? Simply because we want to add kind of pre-processing or logic when I want to set or get or delete a value. And a simple example about this is the example that I started with, age value. So, if anybody try to initialize age value by a negative value, I should throw an exception and the object should not be created in this case. Otherwise, the object will have invalid values for some attributes. So how I can throw this exception, how I can validate this value? So I will define in this case a setter method, and inside this setter method, I'll do all the kind of validation that I want, and if any problem I can throw exceptions, so the process of initializing of my object will not continue. Most probably during my work, I'm using getter or setter, and it's very uncommon to use a deleter method in your class. But just for your info, it's available and you can define it if you want to use it.